We've covered a lot in this series. 5 different things to be exact. But today, I think we're going to take it back a bit. How far back? Far enough back to help the newbies learn this game. And that's what we're going to be talking about in today's episode of... Back to Basics, yo! I know. I'm cringing too. Let's start off with how your turn begins and how it overall just works. The beginning of your turn consists of 3 different phases. Untap, upkeep, draw. Your untap phase is where you take any cards that you had turned sideways, in this case a land, and turn them back face up. This will also work for artifacts and creatures too. Sometimes there isn't much to the upkeep, but there is one important thing to take into consideration, and that is the fact that it happens before you draw your card per turn. The reason that this is important is because on your upkeep there could be some effects that if you were to draw first would change the decision in how you make. For example, if an opponent has a card like Energy Flux on the field, which says all artifacts have an upkeep cost of 2, and if you don't pay that upkeep cost, you sacrifice that artifact, and you just so happen to draw into a card like Tajru Preserver, which says spells and abilities your opponent's control can't cause you to sacrifice permanents, you're probably going to pay for a lot more artifacts than you would have. A very important upkeep effect like Pact of Negation, which says at the beginning of your next upkeep, pay 3 and 2 blue, or you lose the game. Which your group might be cool with takesy-backsies, but in the event you always get that one guy who takes the game way too seriously, I'd say remembering that trigger is pretty important. The main thing here is just that we do have a phase in our turn before we draw our card for turn, which happens at the beginning of every one of your turns. At the beginning of your turn, after you untap and you have your upkeep and you draw, you're always going to draw at least 1 card per turn. So let's go over this real quick. At the beginning of our turn, we have an untap phase, which involves just turning all of our creatures or lands that we used back up. After that, we have an upkeep where any sort of effects can happen, and we also have a draw step. All of these are going to happen at the beginning of each of your turns. Since this is the main thing I see new players have a problem with, I'm kind of just going to go ahead and skim through the rest. So after we draw our card for turn, we have our main phase, which allows us to cast any sort of spells that we would like. And then we have combat, which is a bit more to it than just attacking, but usually combat just consists of turning creatures sideways and attacking your opponents. Usually that's just what it's used for. Then we have a second main phase, which is the same as the first, just after combat. And then we have what is called the end step. The end step is kind of like the upkeep, just at the end of someone else's turn, or your turn. So now that we've talked about what we do during our turn, let's talk about actually casting the spells themselves. Each spell has a restriction called the converted mana cost, or the mana value, which basically looks something like... A card like this has the requirement of 5 total mana being needed to cast it. Not only that, but there are 3 types of mana that you have to spend at least 1 time when casting it. To cast them, you will have needed to spend 1 black mana, 1 blue mana, and 1 green mana. Those are the types of mana that you will have to spend to cover those 3 different types of pips, no matter what. Now when it comes to that little 2 right there, the one at the very end right here, that just means you can use mana of any color to spend it. So you don't have to, you can though spend something like a red mana and a white mana to cast that card. Or you have the option of spending 2 more black mana, 2 more green mana, or 2 more blue mana. You can even spend purple mana to cover that too, if it was a thing. That little 2 right there though just means you need 2 more additional mana of any color to cover that cost. Which is why, again, he has a mana cost of 5. 1 blue, 1 green, 1 black, and 2 mana of any color. This last thing I want to touch on is kind of complicated, sometimes even for more people who have been playing a bit longer, and that being priority and the stack. Priority is always given to the active player, meaning the player whose turn it's on. This gives them the ability to cast spells, however, that doesn't necessarily mean it's going to happen. Once a player has cast a spell, unless stated otherwise, they have officially passed priority. After that, priority is passed around the table in turn order. So in a format like Standard, meaning 2 players are at the table, once player 1 has cast a spell, player 2 has a chance to respond to it. In a game like Commander, though, priority is passed to the player next in turn order. And it has to pass around the entire table for it to resolve. Meaning once player 2 casts a spell, player 3 is given priority, which they can pass on, player 4 back to player 1. Once it goes around the table with no other actions, it resolves. Now let's create a stack in this scenario. Player 2 has priority, and he attempts to cast a spell. Player 3 is given priority, and he has a counterspell, and he's able to cast this on his opponent's turn because it is an instant, meaning he can play that card at any time. Priority then goes back to player 2 because he is the active player. A counterspell of his own that he can cast. Player 3 has no actions and gives priority to player 4. With priority, player 4 casts an instant speed kill spell. Player 2 responds with the DylanCEdh veto, which can't be countered. However, player 1 uses deflecting swat and redirects the targets of DylanCEdh's veto to his original counterspell. In order, the stack then resolves. If you're watching this and you're a judge, please correct me in the comments down below if I screwed anything up there, because again, that stuff right there is pretty complicated. But that's what I've got for y'all today. Thank you for stopping by. If you think there's anything more I need to touch on, please holler my way. All right, y'all have a good one.